let's get started. And I've got it. And let's start with maybe an introduction of Bas. Can you just give a short introduction, maybe your background, etc.
So I need to read this.
No, yeah, whatever you like. This is more like the long explanation, but maybe you can just give a short version.
Okay, so I'm now living in the Netherlands again. I haven't lived here for 20 years, so I started out over 20 years ago as first as a developer, still in Netherlands. Then after working there a couple of years, I moved to Beijing, China, joined Nokia Networks there, so focusing on large telecom products. My early Agile experiences were in the end 90s with mostly extreme programming. When working for a large organization, of course, everyone knew at that time that Agile doesn't work for large-scale development. So we tried out traditional ways of development, only to discover that that definitely doesn't work for large-scale development. Then was responsible for introducing Agile iterative development in Nokia Networks, moved to Finland, lived there a couple of years, found it too cold, moved back to China, joined a management team of a large product, which we transformed to what we then called large Scrum, then moved to Singapore. I lived there for 12 years. It was nice and warm there, unlike here. And then been coaching different organizations. And then last year moved back here and been working in a team mostly. Is that enough for an introduction?
Yeah, no, that's enough. Yeah, and most importantly, just wanna before I forget it, thank you again for joining. And I think you were one of the names that our community asked the most that people would like to experience an interview with. So thanks a lot for taking the time for this, Bas. It's appreciated. So let's start with the first question, and this is actually a question that I included. Maybe just to get started in an hopefully easy way, what would be a 2-minute explanation of less? And you're not stuck to the 2 minutes, but just what would be a short explanation of less?
Okay, well, that's interesting because I went through the questions, and this was the only question I actually had to think about and prepare a little bit, because it's quite hard in 2 minutes. And it's mostly hard in 2 minutes because there's different perspectives or different aspects of less. But since I prepared it, I'll try to do that in 2 minutes and share three different aspects of less. The first one, which is basically how it was accidentally created, is less is an application of an learning loop to an organization. So it is very experimentation focused, and then tries to combine experimentation with systems thinking for understanding the result of the experimentation, and combining that with trying to stay in the Gemba, the teams, the reality of the teams, so that the results that you're seeing of your experimentation are also grounded in the reality of teams. So that's one aspect of it. And then the second aspect, the most obvious one, is the usage of multi-team Scrum, where Scrum has one, and then I'll use the old Scrum guide terminology, development team. And then less is how can we build a product with not one team, but with multiple teams working on that same product. And then probably the favorite perspective or aspect of less is what is sometimes referred to as the descaling aspect, which is the realization that complex organizations are usually slow, and that if you want to achieve the goals of agility and maximizing value delivery, then on one hand, you need to focus on helping the teams, but on the other hand, you need to focus on removing organizational complexity to try to create simpler organizations. And therefore, LESS has quite a lot of focus on the organizational structure, and also thinking in a different way of organizational behavior. Now, was that 2 minutes?
Yeah, well, it was a perfect explanation. So thanks a lot. So I think from this moment on, we can focus on questions raised by our community. And
those are also less prepared from this moment on.
Benji, I think you are in this call. Do you want to elaborate on this question, or do you think this question is good enough as it's shown over here?
I can quickly just, so what I mean by this is, are there any kind of prerequisites maybe that an organization has to have? Does it make more sense if we try to apply less, if the organization already is having Scrum teams? Does it make more sense if they're maybe working still in a traditional way, or like a more waterfallish, or are there any triggers where you would say, okay, here it could or work nicely, or here maybe we rather not try it? Does that help?
I guess not really, as in LESS is built for product development, and I myself wouldn't apply LESS outside of product development. Now, one thing that will be a prerequisite is that typically LESS goes hand in hand with some organizational changes, like the change from what in LESS we call component teams towards feature teams, and functional organizations to cross-functional organizations. And without those organizational changes, you're not going to get very far in a LESS adoption. We probably wouldn't even call it a LESS adoption then. So that means you require a certain level of management support in order to make those changes, because if you're in a team, you simply don't have the organizational authority to make those changes. That said, you can still use some of those ideas, and of course you should always remember that adopting LESS by itself should not be a goal of your organization anyway. Your organization builds product, and successfully building product should be your goal, and not adopting a framework. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Oh, it's me again.
Oh, yeah, I reshuffled the questions a bit, but this made sense to maybe discuss right now. Go ahead, Ben, if you want to elaborate on that one.
I don't really know many scaling frameworks. I've been part of SAFe Agile release train, but that was a few years ago, and I think our company made some adaptations to it. But mainly the question would be, why would I use LESS and not any of the other ones? SAFe, Nexus, I think Scrum at Scale is another one. But maybe why, or what would maybe be the elevator pitch for using this and not anything else?
Well, I'd feel uncomfortable about that, because I'd recommend to use whatever you find most suitable for your particular context. That said, I would strongly recommend against SAFe in every possible context. I personally enjoy the existence of SAFe because it is nearly the exact opposite of LESS, and therefore it makes explaining LESS a bit easier, because you can contrast it with it. But my knowledge and experiences with SAFe have been unanimously negative, creating not an environment that I would call an agile environment. For Scrum at Scale, I've tried figuring out what it exactly means, but it seems hard to understand, because it seems so generic that everything fits it. And Nexus is in a way similar as less, except that it doesn't have the larger organizational focus. In that sense, Nexus is truly more like Scrum, which also doesn't have the larger organizational focus, and therefore just its scope, not in application, but just in content, is, as I understand it, smaller. So that's how I would compare them with each other, and obviously I think less is the best one, but I am slightly biased there.
I see Niels and Andre have added related questions in the chat. And maybe Andre, can you elaborate on or explain your question?
Yes, I can. Bas, you said less is applicable in product development, and I wouldn't use it outside that. Yes. How do you define product development? Is product development software product development? Could it be development of a printer that includes hardware and software? Or in my context, I'm currently coaching a team of BI specialists in a hospital, 30 people. Is that a product or not a product? It kind of feels like less would make sense there, but what are your thoughts?
Well, that's also why I explicitly say product development, because I'd like to take product relatively broadly. So obviously software development, and software development, I see software development as kind of a natural application of less or agile development in general. Yeah. And one of the reasons for that, why I think agile development emerged out of software development, is that software is this malleable material. It's relatively easy to change the material by which we build products with software. Right? And therefore, it makes sense that ways in which you can change your direction during product development are first applied to product development in which the material allows for that. So and that's how I also like to think of product development, is that the harder it becomes to change the material in which you're building your product, the harder it becomes for the application of less or agile development in general, because it will be harder to get those inspect and adapt loops and changing your direction, etc. So that also means that if you do have hardware related products, then almost always do you end up with looking at trying to optimize, trying to improve the ability to change in hardware. And like a good example of that is one less adoption in Tokyo was for a robotics company. Unfortunately, the case study is not written yet, but there the CEO and founder wanted to change the direction all the time, because he is an extreme perfectionist, and in software that went relatively smooth, but as soon as they went to hardware, he would give, well, let's say headaches to the hardware engineers in trying to figure out how to deal with those changes. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, at least the first part. The second part, I'm working with a team of BI specialists that create all kinds of dashboards for managers in hospitals and doctors. Would you consider that a product development?
I don't know enough of it in to give a definitive answer, of course. But you know, my first reaction is yes, although from a less perspective, it would probably be a part of a product rather than a product by itself. But it would definitely be considered product development, because I assume you can build it up gradually and you can have this kind of inspect and adapt loops.
Yes, you can.
I'm slowly going to move to the next question, if that's okay, Andre.
Yeah.
Let's see, Gil, I think you were in the call as well. Do you want to share your question that I'm showing right now?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Bas. So, from the website, and less is about many teams working together on one product. And I'm interested to hear, what does it have to say about many teams working on many products that need to integrate with one another?
Could you give me an example of that to make it more concrete?
Sure. I work on a back-end product in the cloud. We're integrated with a front-end product that's a bit more legacy. Two different products needs to have integration, different release cycles, different people, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So one large aspect of less, and an aspect of less that is very different than most of the Agile community, I'd say, is its product thinking. Like one of the things you'll first need to do when you start a less adoption is figuring out what your product actually is. And in less, we prefer broader product definitions. And that means that usually when you have multiple products, especially when they're within the same company and they integrate with each other, from a less perspective, they're likely to be just one product. And they'll be managed as one product. And to give a different example, when we work with banks, banks often have many different systems, like you mentioned, the back-end system with front-end systems, etc. Most of the time, they'll start their adoption thinking they have hundreds of products. And once they start understanding less, they'll start realizing that from a less perspective, usually they typically have a handful of products, and that's about it, because the product definition is much larger. So for the example that you gave, whenever you have an backend product, then unless an end customer would actually use the backend product directly and like purchase the backend product, then if that's not the case, from a less perspective, it wouldn't be considered a product.
Okay, can I follow that up with another question?
Yeah, sure.
So right now, this backend product is integrated with a front-end product. So you could argue it's one product, but in the future, we will integrate with multiple front-end products, each with their own users, each with their own, experiences and their own, monetization and support and so on. How would you consider that still being one product, at least from the backend team that's developing the multiple integrations?
Again, it's hard without knowing the details of the context, but my initial reaction is yes, probably. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of those is you want to have the trade-offs, like if you talked about multiple front-end solutions with multiple monetization schemes, then you want to have the trade-off between those in your organization visible, whether you want to invest in one or whether you want to invest in another. And once you just look at that from one product, then from a less perspective, it means you'll have one product backlog. And in the one product backlog, these value differences between those multiple front-end products should become very, very visible. And if you don't do that, then you'll need to make that trade-off between those different front-end products. You'll need to make those differently. And that will probably add more complexity, like a product portfolio management, and all of that in your organization. And by having the product definition broader, we try to avoid that complexity and making that trade-off more visible.
Thank you, Bob.
I saw some questions appear.
It's a very short summary of a large topic.
Yeah, yeah. I think you've done a great job, Bas. I noticed some questions appear in the chat. I'm first going to look what the next question on the slide is from Niels. Yeah, let's do this one first. Niels.
Yeah. Like Scrum, it is a prescribing framework, so you should do everything of it, but we know that not all companies do everything of Scrum. And I know, I was wondering whether you have any interesting deviations from the LESS framework as you intended, or as you view it, and what might be like the consequences? What are the most common ones, and what's like the consequences of that?
Okay. The most common and to me worst deviation of LESS that I sometimes encounter is where they start applying less huge terminology to a very small product development. And let me clarify that a little bit. So one of the hard aspects of moving towards LESS is that you have only one product owner for your product. So no matter how many teams you have on your product, you have the product owner. So you do not have product owners per team, or as a friend of mine calls them team output owners. But unfortunately, many teams start off with the product backlog per team and then product owner per team. And therefore, when they need to move to LESS, they'll need to merge the product backlogs and usually let the product owners join the teams. But the most common deviation that I've then seen is to take the less huge terminology where you have areas, and an area is usually 4 to 8 teams, and an area has an area product owner. But they use then this terminology to apply it to their single teams. So they'll declare that every team is one area, therefore they have their own area product owner, their own area product backlog, and then you've just completely faked less or applied less terminology without changing anything to your organization. And that basically completely destroys the purpose of LESS, single backlog, single product owner, etc.
Yeah, cool, interesting. Thanks.
Please don't do that.
I won't. Thank you.
Shane, I just read your question in the chat. I think it's an interesting one. Do you want to share your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I did a training with Craig Larman back 2 or 3 years ago in Munich, and he used causal loop diagrams to explain a lot of the principles and concepts and ideas behind a lot of the LESS topics. And I was wondering if you use that, and if so, because I've had a lot of challenges trying to get people to slow down and use that slow conversation to understand the impacts of these decisions in the system. If you use it, do you have any tips on how to get that practice to stick, or any tips, tricks in that realm?
But then are you referring to specifically the causal loop diagram technique, or helping people with system thinking in general?
I guess more in the systems thinking part, but I found that to be an interesting way to visualize those the complexity of the conversations. So I guess any tips for the systems thinking conversations would be great.
Yeah. So to me, to us, I guess, systems thinking is what I always like to call the foundational principle in less, as in less is a result of applying systems thinking, and especially in Craig's training, in a way he tries to take the people through in 3 days through, in a way, his experience of gradually applying systems thinking to product development to discover less. In my training, I do use systems thinking and systems modeling, but not as intensively as Craig does. But the question was, how do you use it in practice? Now, systems thinking in practice is, to me, that's something that as a coach, and especially when you work with teams and Scrum Masters and management, it's this constant questioning and constantly trying to see the larger picture, try to get them through questioning, try to get them to see how the decisions and the actions they take relate or do not relate to the current problems that they have. And systems modeling, I rarely organize explicit sessions for causal loop diagramming or systems modeling. Rather, I'd use it as a tool to structure an existing ongoing discussion. And it is the conversation and the understanding that is the key point. And systems thinking, systems modeling or causal loop diagram is one technique to help you structure that conversation. So therefore, whenever I'm in a conversation it's not uncommon that conversations kind of go in circles where you end up repeating the same things again, and then you're going back, and then you find yourself saying sentences like I mentioned already earlier, blah. Whenever I'm in such a conversation, then often it's useful to say, let's pause for a moment, and then just write variables on post-it notes and start making relationships between those to help you structure that conversation and get you out of this useless conversational loops. And then I wouldn't mention that we're using causal loop diagramming, or I wouldn't even explain in detail what we're doing, because the focus needs to stay on that conversation.
That makes
sense. And that's often a risk when you start using it. That's what you see in training also, is that when I introduce systems modeling, then people become so focused on the technique that they're kind of missing out on the discussion. So you should try to avoid that, and it's useful to just not explain too much of the technique to avoid that.
That's cool. Thank you.
Thanks. Good question.
Great. Gerald.
Yes, I'm around. Thank you. Yeah, there are other Scrum papers which are updated every 2 to 3 years. And then there are people who really analyze every word of this change and try to interpret, my goodness, why has a certain word changed? And you did something like that 10 years ago. And it seems you didn't really work too much on it during the last years, if I may say so. And still, I like the paper that you wrote at this time. And so I was wondering how you feel about those documents. Are they still good? I mean, obviously, you did not delete them from the web, so they're still around. So you must feel something about them, I guess. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Okay. And then you're referring both to the Scrum primer and the Lean primer.
There are a few more, I guess, but I don't know all of them. Yes, you just extracted some paragraphs out of the books, I think, sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So in general, on the less side, I think we would like to update some of the content more. Especially, we'd like to at some point get the experiments more explicit, and also try to be able to extract those out of the case studies, because we do ask the case studies to be written in explicit experiment form, but we don't really have a way of trying to take them out of those case studies, or a way to link experiments to the case studies, etc. And the reason why we don't or didn't is simply because we haven't had time for that. Both me and Craig really enjoy working in product development. So therefore, I've like most of last year joined the team mostly as a developer, and that was very enjoyable. But it leaves less time to update the content on the less side, and I'm sorry about that. Hopefully, we will get to the ideas that we do have. We'll get to do those also. Then for the Lean primer, I don't think that will change, because I don't see the principles of Lean to actually change. As for the Scrum primer, that one is chosen to not be updated, and especially we are not a fan of the latest version of the Scrum guide. Instead, we've decided to ignore that version nearly completely. And
why is that?
That's a different question. Let me first finish this one. But we've talked about forking off or explaining a specific, a less specific version of Scrum that would be more based on the slightly older version of the Scrum guide. But we've so far decided not to do that, because we're not sure of the benefit of that, because most of the people who are using Scrum and are in a team are actually not reading the Scrum guide. So we're not sure how much impact that would have.
So Bas, and I think also already Gil asked one. Can you maybe share why you're not a big fan of the latest version of the Scrum guide? Are there specific parts in the Scrum guide that you maybe disagree with?
Yes, the usage of Scrum team, and so the earlier Scrum guides had kind of a conflict within the guide itself, where it had a development team and a Scrum team, and then for both it said they're self-organizing or self-managing teams. They have no roles, but then the Scrum team did have roles within that, and there was kind of a bit of an inherent conflict. And for me, I've been around in the Scrum community since 2006, and that conflict has always been in the community also. Now, in the latest Scrum guide, the removal of the development team, which unless the Scrum team doesn't exist, so the removal of the development team and calling them developers, for me, is just a very confusing thing. That the word developers already caused confusion in the community, and changing development team to developers, and then increasing the emphasis on Scrum team, to me, was not a great change. It did not make the Scrum or the guide or the practice clearer. That's the summary. I can, like all of these Scrum nerds, I can talk about it for hours and argue about it for hours.
Time-wise, just so you know, we've got 15 minutes left. Your camera actually stopped working, Bas. Your sound is still very well, but your camera froze, well, at least on my side.
Let me see. Yeah, that is not the best. Let me see if I can fix that.
Well, it gives me time to check another one. I think I'm gonna go back to your question, Gerald, in a moment.
Okay, now the camera should be good again.
Yeah, that's good. Let's first do this one, a different type of question as well. I also want to give Eleonora the opportunity to ask her question.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes, this question comes to my mind because right now, you know, during the COVID emergency, basically we are all working remote, and so what has changed? This has an impact on less working on full remote virtual teams.
Absolutely. So let me try not to give a too long answer to this. Let me give some background on this. So most of my life I've lived in Asia, a long time in China and Singapore. Craig has lived in India for a while, and because of that, both of us very early on got a significant amount of experience with multi-site development, remote development, etc. And in all of our experiences, it's not that it cannot work, but that co-location has still a huge impact in team dynamics. And we felt that so important that co-location is actually a part of the less rules also, which obviously is hard to fulfill at this moment. Now, when I moved to the Netherlands, moved back to the Netherlands, as I mentioned, I joined a team, and one of the reasons was that I wanted to experience remote work as a team member before saying a lot more about that, and especially to see if it can give the same dynamics as a good co-locator team. And I've enjoyed working in my team, and my conclusion is it's not the same. The virtual development that we have now makes building a shared responsibility in a team much harder. It makes the collaboration between team members much harder. It tends to make work more individualistic, and it tends to decrease the team learning. And again, it doesn't have to be like that, but you need to put a significant amount of extra effort in try to avoid that. So I think the virtual development, again, now we don't have any choice, but it has impacted team dynamics mostly a lot, and therefore it also impacts the usage of less, and especially the cross-team dynamics, which are very, very key in less. And I personally hope that I'll be in the future mostly co-located again, because I find it much nicer to work that way.
And related to this, Bas, the conversation that we had yesterday as a preparation on this call is that the less training is also not offered online, right?
No, we have so the most common less training is called a certified less practitioner, which is a 3-day in-person course. And during the COVID time, we did not allow to do that course online. We did created an online variant, which we call the professional certified less practitioner, where you don't get your certificate. And that one is done online, but we don't see the same learning happening in an in-person course as in an online course. And I don't see that. Not all less trainers are in agreement on that. Unfortunately for them, we do get to make this decision.
Okay, let's jump back to the question. Another question by Gerald. If you like Gerald, go ahead.
Yes, that was the one I was most looking forward. So I was hoping to.
I'm not ignoring it, so go ahead.
I was looking at the watches. Thank you. Anyway, Bas, I'm located in the car manufacturing industry in Germany. So when I'm sitting in the office and I look at the other side of the street, I see our adoption of the Toyota production system basically in place with Gogembas, with ceremonies, etc., etc. And well, we touched that already. There's the Lean Primer. I once found a blog post by you where you were talking about visiting Toyota in Japan. And so I was wondering about your view on all those kind of value stream analysis topics and methods in that area. I know that Scrum and Less also are based obviously on value stream topics, but as I see it, it's not as explicitly talked about in these contexts, because it's always about Scrum and Less and not about value stream when we talk about it from my point of view. And last year, I've been coming across a quite interesting book, which was taking the value stream approach to the software development process and seeing software development also as a value stream process. And I openly wanted to ask you to, talk a little bit about this, share your thoughts, perhaps also give examples where you saw this value stream approach more in action and more transparent than I normally see it in a kind of agile environment. Yeah.
I've to answer it very directly. I've not found value stream mapping to be very useful inside product development itself, because it's just not the same kind of process as a manufacturing process, and I do not really apply that. And that's also what you'll see in our writing, where we will mention that at times, but you rarely see it emphasized. But that said, within a larger organization, to get people to think about how do requests come from customers and how long does it take for them to be in development, I use techniques like value stream mapping, and those are very useful. I find it fascinating to get a group of people together and then say, okay, from our customer to the team, what is actually in between? And often then people are amazed how much is actually in between that still, and they were not aware of that. So for that larger picture, I found value stream methods like value stream mapping, not exactly as described in the typical manufacturing books, useful, but within, so from the product backlog to the product, in that context, I've not found it useful. And also, like in SAFe, I believe they have things that they call value streams, and that I personally don't find a very useful approach. And one of the reasons also is that if you fix the value streams in your development, they become kind of like requirements area, but they kind of miss the dynamic aspect of that, right? Where in product development, in these 3 months, this aspect of the product might have a very high priority, and the next 3 months, a completely different aspect has a high priority. And if you're going to fix the different parts of your product in value streams, then you're creating an unnecessary inflexibility in your organization. Was that enough thoughts?
Yes, I think so. Take a quick input. Thank you.
Thank you.
I know there are more questions, so you know.
Yeah, let's see. We've got about 5 to 7 minutes left. Let's see. I'm just quickly going to go through the questions that we have. We've got one more by Eleonora, another by Gerald, Benji. I'm not sure, Bas, if you see the Google presentation. Maybe there's a question that you see that I'm skipping right now that you would like to address. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick one.
I liked the one from Eleonora, the one with a lot of text.
Yeah, this one.
And then the next big thing we'll need to schedule last, I guess.
Okay, yeah, so let's go for this
typical.
One. So we can read it together, or Eleonora, do you want to explain your question?
Oh, basically it's about product, so mindset, let me call it like that. So this is a very nice quote of Bas that I found in The Art of Agile Development. That is that basically we need everyone on the team to be involved in customer knowledge, because only in that way we are enabled to work in an incrementally iterative way. Working. So my question is, how can we do this practically and in the smoother way as possible? You know, my experience is that sometimes the more technical member of the team, like developers or front-ender, says, "Oh, why I need to do discovery for together?" You know, because it's some way feeling that they are losing time to discover more the business. So it's quite tough to try to explain why they need to do this kind of discovery activities all together.
Yeah. And let me first frame the answer a little bit. Nowadays, sometimes I like to say that in a less adoption, you need to guide your teams through 2 different journeys. And the first one is from being used to being told what to do to becoming a self-managing team. I always enjoy that one. I always enjoy that one a lot, because one of the most fascinating aspects of that is that, you know, when you tell a team what they need to do, then often they start complaining about that. But then when you give the team the freedom for them to manage themselves, then in the beginning, they still start complaining about that because they still don't realize themselves that they're the one making that decision. So the second one is the one that this quote is about, which is from, you know, being a programmer. So tell me exactly what I should build, to a product developer. And a product developer to me means I have mostly technical skills. You, your customer, you have a problem that needs solving. And the best solution will be once I understand your problem and can help you understand how technology can help in solving that problem, right? And therefore, obviously, that means that instead of getting the requirements, you need to understand the problem that your customers tries to solve. Now, tips for making that journey smooth. And I don't think it will be smooth. It usually takes quite a while. one of the things that I try to do is start with the people that traditionally tell the requirements, either customers or analysts or product managers, etc., and try to get them to stop just telling the team what to do and just ask them questions and or sometimes just take them away and then give a team a problem and then say, okay, how do we what do we do to implement this particular feature or problem for a customer? So therefore, the team at that point doesn't need to change yet. We're just avoiding them to be spoon-fed with the requirements by changing the person who's spoon-feeding them. Then one of the lesser adoptions that I worked with, one of the practices that I enjoyed that my fellow Scrum Master there did, we had 5 teams there, and most of what we're talking about now in this discovery and the clarification of what the teams does, most of that in less happens in multi-team backlog refinement. And in multi-team backlog refinement, he, as the coach or Scrum Master, would sometimes just walk to a whiteboard where the team was talking about, and he would write problem ? And say, what problem are you trying to solve? And then he would walk away immediately and leaving the team puzzled, wondering what just happened. But it was a very simple thing of trying to introduce a bit of surprise and take the team out of what do we need to do to what problem are we actually solving. And it's mostly this kind of techniques. Now, one of the ways of thinking that it's not completely formulated in my head, but that I've been creating is that we have different types of events. We have events where we together create knowledge and events in which we transfer knowledge from one person to other people. And most of the less events ought to be where we together create knowledge rather than just transfer knowledge from one person to the team. And that nowadays I try to use that as a way of framing events. And then I also try to ask the team whether they created knowledge in this event or whether it was simply one person telling them something.
Thanks, Bas.
Thank you.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, and I liked the one, maybe just the next big thing question. Let me wrap up with this one. Any thoughts about that, Bas?
Okay, so what has changed over the last 20 years? Not a lot. I think one of the things that you see constantly is the watering down of terminology and then creating new terms to mean the old thing. Right. So a good example of that is continuous integration. Continuous integration, when I started adopting that, meant what we would now refer to as continuous deployment. But unfortunately, it got watered down to mostly an automated build and test. And therefore, we started creating new terms to basically mean the same thing. So I don't think a lot is, I honestly don't think a lot has changed over the last 20 years. And we're still struggling with adopting a lot of the ideas that were created very early on in Agile development. Specifically the development practices created are still, unfortunately, not as widely adopted then I would like to see them. The idea of sitting with your customers and users and having conversations are still not as widely adopted, and instead are kind of ruined by tools like Jira. So I don't think there's a next, sorry to be disappointing, I don't think there's a next big thing. I think we'll need to get much better at actually adopting the things that are already there more deeply and more widely. And I know that's a very disappointing last answer, but I think that's the way it is for me.
Yeah, it's an honest answer. Thanks a lot. So let's start wrapping it up, and let's go to this one. Bas mentioned a couple of books a couple of times. I've included the links. So if you are interested in learning more about LESS, then check the website of LESS itself, or read the books that Bas and Craig Larman wrote together. And you can see the links over there. And this is also the moment that I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll share a link of the Google presentation also afterwards again, and so that you can check these links. I'm just going to leave meeting, log out my laptop as well. Hello, now I see much more faces. I'm going to stop the recording. So also officially for people that are listening to this recording, Bas, thanks a lot for your time and effort. And I learned myself as well a lot. And maybe you can give a virtual applause to Bas somehow. Everyone is muted, but there's the applause. You can see it. Let's see, stop recording.